Tonight, I'd like you to settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day loosen its grip. We are going to travel somewhere that is often misunderstood, a world of cold fjords, long wooden halls, and windswept coastlines. A world many imagine as loud and chaotic. But tonight, we will discover something quieter. We will step into the structured world of the Vikings. Not the clashing swords, not the roaring raids, but the rules. Because beneath the legends, beneath the horned helmet myths and smoky battlefields, there existed something far more enduring than violence. There was a law. There were expectations. There were routines. And many of those routines still quietly shape your life today. You may not realize it when you glance at the calendar and see Thursday. You may not think of it when you sit on a jury. You likely don't consider it when you respect a property boundary or sign your name to a contract. But echoes of the Viking Age remain. Tonight, we will explore those echoes slowly, gently. From the mud beneath a farmer's boots, to the careful seating order inside a chieftain's hall. So take a slow breath in. And imagine now that you are waking in Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. Imagine the roof above you. It is low and timbered. The beams are darkened with years of smoke. The air smells faintly of wood ash and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. You are lying on a wooden platform covered in wool and animal skins. It is still dim. Dawn has not fully arrived. Before you rise, before you stretch, before you step outside into the pale northern light, you are already inside a web of rules. Not written rules, not posted on walls, but known, memorized, recited, expected. The Viking world was not wild chaos. It was structured by expectations that guided nearly every action of your day. And if you failed to follow them, consequences would follow, not necessarily violent ones, but social ones, legal ones, reputational ones. Let us begin with something simple. Property. When you step outside your longhouse, the land around you is not undefined wilderness. It belongs to someone. There are no fences as you might imagine them today. No neat wooden posts lining every boundary. Instead, there are stones. Subtle markers placed in fields. Small piles carefully positioned on ridges. Sometimes a carved post. Sometimes a natural landmark, a bent tree, a stream, a large glacial rock. You are expected to know where your land ends and another's begins. Moving a boundary stone is not a minor offense. It is serious. It disrupts order. It threatens survival. And even today, thousands of years later, property boundaries remain sacred. We register deeds. We survey land. We argue in court over inches of soil. The instinct to define space, to formalize ownership, echoes directly from worlds like this one. Now imagine the rhythm of your week. You may think of Monday as a nuisance, Thursday as nearly the weekend. But these names carry something ancient. In the Viking world, days were named after gods. Tyr's Day, Odin's Day, Thor's Day. Tyr, a god of justice and law. Odin, associated with wisdom and authority. Thor, protector and thunderer. When you say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you are softly repeating echoes of Norse cosmology. It feels ordinary, but it is an inheritance. An inheritance was itself governed by strict rule. In your Viking village, land does not simply pass to whoever wishes it. It follows a hierarchy. Sons often inherit before daughters, though daughters are not without rights. Widows may retain control of property. Extended kin may contest divisions. Disputes are not handled privately for long. They go to the thing. The thing is not an abstract concept. It is a physical gathering. An assembly of free men, and sometimes women, who meet at designated sites to resolve conflicts. Attendance is not casual. It is expected. If summoned, you must go. Imagine walking to the assembly site. Perhaps it is held near a river bend or a rocky outcrop. People gather in cloaks, carrying small bundles of food. Conversations are low and measured. There is no permanent courthouse. The law lives in memory. A law speaker stands and recites. He does not read from parchment. He speaks from recall, repeating laws passed down for generations. His voice must be steady, accurate, trusted. If you are involved in a dispute, perhaps over livestock wandering into a neighbor's pasture. Your case will be heard in front of others. Compensation may be ordered. And here we encounter another rule that may seem strange yet deeply familiar. Wargild, a system of compensation for harm. If someone is injured or killed, there is a structured payment assigned according to status. It is not arbitrary. It is codified. Different classes of people carry different compensation values. It may sound cold, but consider this. Today we assign monetary damages in civil courts. We calculate settlements. We quantify harm. The principle that conflict should be resolved by structured restitution is not new. It is ancient. Now think about reputation. In your Viking village, reputation is currency. There are no credit scores. There are no written contracts signed with witnesses and stored in vaults. Instead, there are oaths. An oath is sacred. Breaking one does not simply damage your standing. It may isolate you from trade, marriage alliances, and protection. To be declared an outlaw is one of the most severe penalties possible. Outlawry does not always mean immediate violence. It means removal from legal protection. You are outside the system. And humans, even today, fear social exile deeply. We may not use the word outlaw, but we still enforce belonging and exclusion through law, reputation, and institutional trust. Now imagine hospitality. A stranger arrives at your door. You are expected to offer food and shelter. There are rules governing how long a guest may stay. Rules governing how a guest must behave. Hospitality is not merely kindness. It is obligation. The climate is harsh. Winter is long. Refusing shelter could mean death. So there is structure even in generosity. And still today, echoes remain in legal obligations toward travelers, tenants, and guests. The rhythm of your agricultural life is equally governed. Planting must occur at the proper time. Harvest cannot be delayed. Fishing seasons follow cycles. Winter stores must be measured carefully. You do not farm whenever you please. You farm according to inherited knowledge, a rulebook written in seasons. The year is not counted casually. It is measured in winters. How many winters have you seen? Age itself is defined by survival through cold cycles. And survival requires coordination. If your neighbor fails to maintain irrigation channels, your crops suffer. If you neglect communal grazing rules, tensions rise. Individual freedom exists, but it is embedded inside collective expectation. Now pause for a moment. Picture the longhouse again. Smoke curling slowly upward. Children learning by watching elders. Stories told at night, not simply for entertainment but to reinforce norms. Saga heroes are praised for loyalty, oath-keeping, measured revenge, not random violence. The rule is balance. Even vengeance has structure. If a family member is wronged, retaliation is expected. But it must follow recognized procedure. Compensation can replace escalation. Feuds are regulated. This may seem paradoxical, structured vengeance. But even today, legal systems evolved from negotiated settlements and restorative practices. The Viking world, often portrayed as chaotic, was in fact rule-bound to an extraordinary degree. Rules about land, water, marriage, trade, speech, assembly, time, and perhaps most quietly of all, rules about belonging. To be part of the system was safety. To fall outside it was danger. As the day progresses in your imagined village, you move through these invisible structures without conscious thought. You know where to stand in the assembly. You know how to address a chieftain. You know when to speak and when to remain silent. Order is comfort. Predictability is survival. And as evening settles and the firelight flickers against wooden walls, you may begin to realize something unexpectedly soothing. The Vikings were not reckless wanderers. They were meticulous participants in a structured world. A world whose rules still shape your calendar, your courts, your contracts, your sense of personal honor. The bizarre is not so bizarre after all. It is simply old, very old, and still with you. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of that continuity. In the next segment, we will move from everyday villagers to a man who helped preserve many of these rules. Not through battle, but through memory and writing. Imagine Iceland in the early 13th century. The great age of Viking raids has long faded. The longships are still there, pulled up along rocky shores, but the world has changed. Christianity has taken root. Norway has grown more centralized. Political tensions ripple quietly beneath the surface. And in a modest but well-appointed farmstead called Reykholt lives a man named Snorri Sturluson. Snorri is not a warrior in the way you might expect. He does not stride constantly across battlefields. Instead, he is something far more subtle. He is a law speaker, a historian, a poet, and in many ways a preserver of rules. As you imagine him, picture a broad-shouldered Icelandic chieftain in woolen garments, seated at a wooden table illuminated by oil lamps. Outside, the wind brushes against turf-roofed buildings. Inside, parchment lies carefully arranged before him. Snorri lived in a society that still relied heavily on memory. Iceland's Althing, one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world, depended on the law speaker to recite legal codes aloud each year. The law was not simply stored, it was performed. For generations, these rules lived in human memory. But Snorri did something extraordinary. He wrote. He compiled stories of kings, genealogies, myths of Odin and Thor, and accounts of Norwegian rulers. His most famous works, often grouped as the Prose Edda and Heimskringla, were not merely entertainment. They were cultural preservation. They recorded the cosmology that shaped Viking weak names. They described the moral codes of heroes. They preserved the genealogies that justified land ownership and inheritance. They embedded the very rules we discussed earlier into narrative form. Now imagine yourself in his world. You are not simply living under rules, you are witnessing their transformation from oral memory to written permanence. Snorri's Iceland was governed by a complex network of chieftains known as Gore. Power was not centralized like a modern nation-state. Authority flowed through alliances, kinship ties, and legal agreements. Disputes were handled through the Althing, where cases were presented publicly. The legal system was intricate. Cases could hinge on the precise wording of an oath. Witnesses were required in specific numbers. Timelines for filing claims were strictly regulated. Miss a deadline and your case could collapse. There were rules about how many neighbors must be present when declaring a claim on land. Rules about how far a piece of driftwood could be claimed from shore. Rules about how compensation should be divided among kin. It may seem almost obsessively detailed. But in a world without police forces or prisons as we understand them, clarity was essential. Social order depended on shared memory. Snorri understood this. But he was also a politician. And here the rhythm becomes more complicated. Snorri traveled to Norway. He cultivated relationships with Norwegian kings. He navigated the delicate balance between Icelandic independence and Norwegian influence. Power in the medieval North was subtle. It was not simply about force. It was about alliances sealed with marriage, promises, and carefully worded agreements. Snorri himself became entangled in these political webs. He supported one Norwegian claimant to the throne, then hesitated. He shifted loyalties as many politicians must. His choices eventually led to suspicion. In 1241, men arrived at his estate. He was killed in his cellar. The details are sparse. The event was quiet but decisive. And yet, even here, the pattern holds. His death was not random chaos. It was the culmination of political alliances and betrayals, structured power struggles within a rule-bound society. But what endures is not the violence. What endures is the writing. Without Snorri's careful documentation, much of what we know about Norse mythology, law, and royal lineage might have faded entirely. Through him, the names of Odin, Thor, and Frey survived Christianization. Through him, the logic of Viking assemblies and codes entered European historical memory. Even the structure of heroic storytelling, the arc of exile, endurance, and measured revenge, filtered into later European literature. Now pause and imagine the quiet inside Snorri's study. The scratch of a quill, the low murmur of dictation, the patient copying of sagas. He was not preserving chaos. He was preserving structure, preserving rule, preserving the idea that societies, even in the far north, function through shared expectation. And there is something unexpectedly calming about that. The Viking world was not a storm without pattern. It was a carefully negotiated order, oral at first, then written. Snorri did not invent these rules. He captured them. He ensured that centuries later, you would still speak the names of Norse gods each week without realizing it. You would still value sworn testimony. You would still believe that laws, once established, deserve preservation. The flickering oil lamp in his Icelandic hall illuminated more than parchment. It illuminated continuity. Take a slow breath. In the next segment, we will move from written preservation to a single pivotal moment. A day when alliances shifted and the balance of Scandinavian power quietly transformed. Imagine standing in the open fields of Thingvellir around the year 1000. The air is cool. The grass bends in the wind. Lava cliffs rise like dark, silent walls around the gathering place. This is the Althing, the National Assembly of Iceland, where disputes are settled, alliances are forged, and laws are spoken aloud. You are one among many. Farmers wrapped in wool cloaks. Chieftains seated with careful dignity. Traders who have crossed the sea. Families who have journeyed days to be present. Tensed up the landscape. Smoke from cooking fires drifts lazily upward. Voices hum in steady conversation. But beneath the calm gathering, tension moves like a quiet undercurrent. Christianity has been spreading across Scandinavia. Norwegian kings, eager to unify their realms, have embraced it. Trade routes increasingly connect to Christian Europe. Baptism is becoming not only a spiritual matter, but a political one. And Iceland stands divided. Some chieftains have accepted Christianity. Others remain loyal to the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, whose names still echo in poetry and daily speech. This is not simply a religious debate. It is a question of law. If Iceland adopts Christianity, it must abandon certain pagan practices, public sacrifices, the exposure of unwanted infants, certain ritual observances, the authority of old religious customs. If it refuses, it risks isolation from Norway, its most powerful trading partner. The assembly gathers. Arguments are presented calmly but firmly. Imagine yourself sitting in the grass, listening. There are no raised swords here, no charging armies. Instead, there are words, measured, deliberate, structured. At the heart of the decision stands the law speaker, a man tasked with memorizing and reciting the law. His role is immense. He must guide the nation toward unity. The law speaker at the time, according to tradition, withdrew alone beneath a cloak for a day and a night to consider the matter. Whether literal or symbolic, the image remains powerful. A single figure, wrapped in wool, lying in contemplation while the nation waits. When he rose, he did not declare total victory for either side. Instead, he offered compromise. Iceland would become officially Christian. Baptism would be required. But certain pagan practices could continue privately for a time. Eating horse meat, exposure of infants, quiet sacrifices, until the transition stabilized. It was a legal solution, not an emotional one, not a dramatic overthrow, a negotiated rule change. The assembly accepted it. And just like that, Iceland shifted faith without civil war. Pause and imagine the relief. The fires continue burning. The sheep still graze. Children still chase one another between tents. Life continues. But the rules have changed. This moment illustrates something subtle about Viking society and about rules in general. Change did not always arrive in chaos. It could arrive through structured dialogue, through compromise, through public agreement. And even when belief systems transformed, the method of decision, assembly, law, consensus remained intact. The Vikings are often remembered for raids and longships. Yet here, the decisive moment is quiet. A gathering, a debate, a cloaked thinker beneath the open sky. And this pattern, negotiation over annihilation, shaped Scandinavian governance long after. Christian law codes were written. Churches were built. Yet assemblies continued. Legal frameworks adapted, but the structure of collective decision remained. You can almost hear the steady rhythm of recited laws carried on the wind. There is something surprisingly modern about it. A society facing division. A leader withdrawing for reflection. A compromise that prevents bloodshed. The rules shift, but the commitment to law endures. And perhaps that is one of the most enduring Viking rules of all. The belief that order is negotiated, not simply imposed. Let the wind at Thingvellir fade gently now. In the next segment, we will move from open assemblies to something buried beneath the earth. A mystery discovered centuries later, where Viking rule and ritual are revealed through quiet archaeology. Now imagine the soft scrape of a shovel against damp soil. It is the year 1904 in Norway. Farmers working their land uncover something unusual beneath a grassy mound. At first, it seems like any other burial hill, one of many scattered across the Scandinavian countryside. But as the earth is slowly removed, the outline of a ship begins to appear. Not fragments, not scattered planks, an entire vessel preserved in clay-rich soil. This is what we now call the Oseberg ship. It had been buried around the year 834, nearly a millennium earlier. Imagine standing there as archaeologists carefully brush soil away from carved wood. The scent of wet earth hangs in the air. The grain of oak emerges, dark and smooth despite the centuries. This was no ordinary burial. 2 women lay within the ship, one older, one younger. Their bodies had long since returned to the earth, but their presence remained in the arrangement of objects around them. Fine textiles, carved sleighs, beds with intricate animal designs, buckets adorned with brass fittings. Even the remains of animals, horses, dogs, oxen, placed carefully beside them. There is no violence here, no battle scene. Instead, there is deliberate ceremony, a rule of reverence. In Viking society, certain individuals, whether rulers, priestesses, or figures of high standing, were honored with ship burials. The ship symbolized passage, not conquest, a journey onward. Imagine the day of that funeral in the 9th century. The ship drawn onto land. Villagers gathered in solemn quiet. Objects placed carefully inside. The earth piled slowly over the hull. The act itself would have taken hours, perhaps days. A community acknowledging hierarchy through ritual. Here again we see rules at work. Who is buried this way? Who receives such honor? Who is permitted such wealth in death? Burial customs were not casual choices. They reflected social order, authority, belief. The older woman in the Oseberg burial may have been a queen, or perhaps a powerful religious figure. Scholars still debate her identity. The younger woman may have been a companion or attendant. The exact details remain uncertain, but the structure of the burial reveals something clear. Status mattered deeply. Death did not erase hierarchy. It formalized it. The Viking world, often portrayed as chaotic, was in fact structured by intricate expectations of loyalty, of tribute, of ritual correctness. Even in death, there were procedures to follow. Grave goods were selected with care. Symbols were intentional. The carved animal heads found in the burial, twisting serpents and gripping beasts, reflect artistic rules as well. Scandinavian art followed recognizable styles, evolving in phases. Patterns repeated. Motifs carried meaning. Nothing was random. Even grief moved within structure. As the burial mound rose above the ship, it became a visible marker in the landscape, a statement of continuity, a reminder, a rule made visible in earth and timber. Certain lives are to be remembered differently. Centuries later, when archaeologists revealed the ship once more, it quietly reminded modern observers of the same thing: that ritual is power, that structure survives, that even the most bizarre customs, burying a full ship in soil, were logical within their worldview. Imagine the cool stillness of that burial mound before excavation. Grass growing, seasons passing, snow settling gently each winter. For 1,000 years the ship waited, silent, intact, a rule preserved beneath the earth. And as we leave the burial mound behind, we move now from ritual to belief, from physical evidence to the inner world of thought and cosmology. In the next segment, we will explore how Viking spiritual frameworks shaped everyday rules, how myth and morality intertwined in quiet but persistent ways. Imagine standing at the edge of a cold northern shoreline at dusk. The sea is calm. The sky is pale silver. A faint wind moves through tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a raven calls. In the Viking world, moments like this were not empty. They were filled with meaning. Life was governed not only by visible rules, laws, assemblies, social ranks, but by unseen frameworks of belief. And many of the rules we still echo today come quietly from these spiritual foundations. The Norse cosmos was not simple. It was layered, interconnected, structured. At its center stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree, not merely a mythic plant but a symbolic map of existence. Its roots and branches connected different realms: the world of gods, the world of humans, the lands of giants, and the shadowed places of the dead. To live in this system was to accept that order and chaos coexisted, that fate existed, that destiny was woven. The Norns, three figures often compared to the fates of other mythologies, were believed to weave the threads of life. Even the gods were not entirely free from destiny. And here we see one of the most enduring Viking legacies: the belief that one must meet fate with composure. Not panic, not hysteria, composure. In Norse literature, heroes rarely beg for mercy. They rarely collapse into despair. Instead, they acknowledge what must be faced. This cultural expectation, that dignity in adversity is a virtue, still echoes in modern ideas about stoicism. We often praise staying strong or keeping your composure. These values did not begin in corporate offices or self-help books. They have deep roots in warrior societies where fear had to be managed quietly. Now imagine the importance of oaths. In Viking society, spoken promises were sacred. An oath sworn before witnesses, particularly at a legal assembly or before a chieftain, carried spiritual weight. Breaking an oath was not merely rude. It disrupted cosmic balance. Reputation, what the Norse called drengskapur, was everything. Honor was not abstract, it was social currency. A person known for oath-breaking could lose protection, alliances, even livelihood. Today, contracts are written in ink and sealed by legal systems. But the idea that a promise binds you morally, that your word matters, has echoes of these older traditions. Even wedding vows carry this ancient weight. Another quiet rule: hospitality. To deny shelter to a traveler in harsh northern climates could mean death. So hospitality became both practical and sacred. In Norse texts like the Havamal, attributed to Odin, there are detailed instructions on how to behave as a guest, and how to behave as a host. Offer food, warmth, measured speech, restraint in boasting. It may surprise you that Viking culture, often portrayed as chaotic and loud, valued moderation in conversation. Speaking too much was frowned upon. Listening carefully was wise. These expectations created social stability in small communities where everyone knew one another. The rhythm of belief shaped daily behavior. You did not simply act for yourself. You acted under the gaze of ancestors, gods, and neighbors. And then there was the concept of Ragnarok, the eventual destruction and renewal of the world. Unlike some religious systems promising eternal paradise, Norse cosmology accepted that even gods would fall. The world would burn. It would sink. And yet, it would rise again. This cyclical understanding of catastrophe and renewal fostered resilience. If everything ends, then how you face the ending matters. It encouraged preparation, endurance, a calm acknowledgement of impermanence. Even today, in subtle ways, we carry this mindset, particularly in cultures that value resilience during hardship. We prepare for disasters. We insure against loss. We speak of rebuilding after collapse. These are not uniquely Viking ideas, of course, but in the Norse world, they were articulated clearly through story and ritual, and the stories were powerful. Gathered in longhouses during winter, families listened to sagas, tales of ancestors, heroes, and gods. These stories reinforced norms quietly. They taught consequences. They modeled courage. They demonstrated the cost of arrogance. Through repetition, values became embedded. Imagine the glow of firelight on wooden walls, the crackle of embers, the steady voice of a storyteller reciting lines memorized across generations. Children listening, absorbing, learning not through written law codes but through narrative rhythm. It is not so different from today. We still pass values through stories, in books, films, conversations. We still admire characters who show loyalty, endurance, composure. The Viking rules were not always written. They lived, they spoke, they were believed. And as we gently move forward, we shift from inner belief to outer structure, from spiritual codes to economic ones. Because alongside fate and honor stood something very practical: trade. We will now explore how commerce, quiet, persistent, organized, shaped the Viking world more deeply than raids ever did. Imagine yourself not as a warrior but as a merchant. You stand at the edge of a wooden dock. The air smells faintly of tar and salt. Bundles of fur are stacked neatly. Amber beads catch the pale northern light. Scales and small weights lie carefully arranged on a plank table. The Viking world was not sustained by raids alone. It was sustained by trade. Long before modern banking systems, Viking traders moved through rivers and coastlines stretching from Scandinavia to the British Isles, from the Baltic to Byzantium, and deep into the rivers of Eastern Europe. They carried walrus ivory, furs, timber, iron, and amber outward. They brought back silver coins, silk, spices, glassware. This trade required something very important: trust. You could not operate a long-distance network without predictable rules. And so Vikings developed standardized weights and measures. Small bronze or iron weights were carefully shaped and calibrated. Scales were portable, often folded into small wooden boxes. Transactions were deliberate. Silver was often cut into pieces, known as hack silver, weighed rather than counted. Value was determined by weight and purity, not stamped authority. This habit of weighing and verifying has echoes today. When we check receipts, when we compare prices, when we verify authenticity, the quiet insistence on measurable fairness became embedded in economic life. And then there were trade towns. Places like Hedeby, Birka, and later Dublin grew into bustling centers of exchange. These were not chaotic raiding camps. They were organized settlements with streets, workshops, docks, and designated market areas. Craftsmen worked leather, forged tools, shaped glass beads. Merchants negotiated calmly. Deals were discussed over shared meals. Trade required stability. Stability required law, which is why economic growth reinforced the importance of assemblies and legal codes. A merchant traveling through foreign lands needed assurance that disputes could be resolved without violence. Law reduced uncertainty. Law enabled commerce. Even today, our global economy depends on predictable systems: contracts, courts, regulation. The Vikings understood in their own way that prosperity required structure. There is another rule we quietly inherited: diversification. Viking ships rarely carried a single commodity. Cargo was mixed: furs, iron, slaves, textiles, weapons. If one market failed, another might succeed. This instinct to spread risk remains central to modern finance. It is not dramatic. It is not heroic. It is practical. And practicality often shapes history more than glory. Now imagine the ships themselves. Long, narrow hulls built for both river and sea. Flexible enough to ride waves. Shallow enough to navigate inland waterways. These ships were not only instruments of war. They were logistical masterpieces. Crew members worked in rhythm, rowing, steering, adjusting sails. On trade voyages, weeks passed quietly. There were no battles. Only wind, water, maintenance, conversation. The monotony of maritime trade required patience, and patience became part of cultural identity. The image of the Viking as endlessly aggressive obscures this quieter reality. Much of their success came from adaptability and calculation. And then there was silver itself. Thousands of Arabic dirhams have been discovered in Scandinavian hoards. Coins from distant Islamic caliphates ended up buried in Nordic soil. This tells us something subtle but important. The Viking world was interconnected. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Art styles blended. Languages mixed. Religious influences shifted gradually. Economic networks shaped cultural exchange. And with exchange came rules. Agreements on weights. Expectations of honesty. Punishments for fraud. These were not glamorous innovations, but they were foundational. In many ways, the commercial mindset, careful, measured, organized, softened the harsher edges of warrior culture. Trade required negotiation. Negotiation required restraint. Restraint required social norms. So while sagas celebrate raids, daily life in trade centers was often methodical. Accounts kept, goods inspected, ships repaired, conversations measured. The Viking world, far from being purely chaotic, was deeply structured beneath the surface. And as wealth accumulated, so too did social differences. Silver hoards did not belong equally to everyone. Some men and women rose higher. Some built larger halls. Some displayed greater luxury. And so we now move toward our final thematic section, the world of those who benefited most from these rules. The elite, the chieftains, the jarls. Their lives reveal the final contrast. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a gathering field. The wind moves slowly across the grass. Cloaks ripple. Men and women stand in a wide circle. Weapons remain sheathed. Voices remain measured. This is the thing, the Viking assembly. Power in the Viking world was not absolute. It was negotiated. Chieftains, known as jarls, did not rule by decree alone. They relied on loyalty, reputation, and consensus. A leader who ignored his followers could quickly find himself isolated. There were no vast bureaucracies. No centralized standing armies in the early periods. Authority depended on networks of obligation. You follow a chieftain because he protects you. He protects you because you follow him. It is a quiet contract. Oaths were not casual promises. They were sacred bonds, often sworn over rings or weapons. Breaking an oath was more than dishonesty, it was social exile. And exile in a harsh northern landscape was almost a sentence to disappear. At the assembly, disputes were aired publicly. Witnesses spoke. Compensation was calculated. Judgments were announced not in dramatic tones, but with deliberate formality. The goal was not vengeance. The goal was balance. Compensation systems, known as wergild, assigned value to injury or death. Payment could prevent cycles of revenge. It turned chaos into calculation. This principle still exists today. Civil courts award damages rather than encouraging retaliation. Financial compensation replaces personal feud. It is less emotionally satisfying perhaps, but far more stabilizing. Power in Viking society also flowed through kinship. Family alliances determined influence. Marriage was political as much as personal. A union between families strengthened networks of protection. Inheritance rules preserved property within kin groups. Land, livestock, silver, these passed carefully between generations. Hierarchy was visible but not distant. At the top were jarls, wealthy landholders and military leaders. Below them were free farmers, the backbone of society. Below them were thralls, enslaved individuals captured in raids or born into bondage. Mobility was possible but limited. Freedom mattered deeply. To be free was to speak at the thing, to carry weapons, to own land. Even today, the language of freedom remains central in many northern societies. The Viking emphasis on autonomy and landholding left subtle cultural impressions. Leadership was also performative. A chieftain hosted feasts not simply to celebrate, but to demonstrate generosity. Gift-giving reinforced loyalty. A ring, a finely crafted sword, a share of silver. These material offerings created emotional bonds. Power required visibility. It required presence. You could not rule from isolation. This blending of leadership, law, and reputation created a political system that was fluid rather than rigid. When Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia, these older systems adapted rather than vanished overnight. Assemblies continued. Local governance remained participatory in many areas. The Viking world, often imagined as chaotic, was structured by expectations. Speak honestly. Honor agreements. Attend assemblies. Support your leader. Protect your kin. These were not bizarre rules. They were stabilizing ones. And they echo faintly still, in local councils, jury systems, parliamentary traditions across Northern Europe. As power consolidated over time, particularly under kings like Harald Fairhair in Norway or later Scandinavian monarchs, these systems grew more centralized. but the cultural memory of participatory assemblies endured. Now, let us step into a space where these rules culminate in their most visible form, where power is displayed, where wealth is arranged deliberately, where order replaces mud and smoke. We enter the hall of the elite. Imagine stepping through a heavy wooden doorway. The smell of smoke remains, but it is cleaner here. Resin torches burn steadily. The hall is long and high-roofed, beams carved with subtle designs. Animal skins lie across benches. Tapestries soften the walls. Shields hang in neat rows, polished, not battered. At the center runs a long hearth, its fire contained and steady. This is not the farmstead of Segment 1. This is authority made visible. The chieftain sits on an elevated seat at the far end. The high seat, carved, symbolic, positioned to oversee the room. Guests sit according to status. Placement is not random. Rank determines proximity. Meals are abundant compared to peasant fare. Roasted meats, fresh bread, imported spices for the wealthy, meat flows in carved horns. But even here, rules govern behavior. Speech follows protocol. Toasting rituals are structured. Boasts are measured. Honor remains central. The hall is not chaos. It is choreography. Wealth here is displayed not only in food but in objects. Silver arm rings, decorated swords, fine wool dyed with imported pigments, glass beads from distant lands. Each object tells a story of trade, negotiation, and power. Even leisure is structured. Skalds, poets recite sagas. Their verses preserve genealogy and victory. Storytelling is not idle entertainment. It is memory as authority. To be remembered is to remain powerful. The elite world is quieter than legend suggests. There are no constant battles within these walls. There is management, planning, alliance building. And outside, beyond the warm light of the hall, the farms continue. The trade routes continue. The assemblies continue. The rules persist. The Viking elite lived in relative comfort, yes, but their comfort depended entirely on the structured world beyond their doors. Without farmers, without merchants, without law, the hall would empty. And so we see the contrast clearly. Mud and smoke, silver and carved wood, salted fish, spiced meat. Yet both worlds operate under shared rules, law, loyalty, obligation, balance. And perhaps that is the most enduring inheritance. Not axes, not horns, but systems. Systems designed to prevent chaos. Systems designed to create predictability. As the firelight flickers against carved beams, imagine the steady breathing of those gathered. Voices soften. Conversations fade. Outside, the wind moves across northern fields. Inside, order holds. We began with the idea of bizarre Viking rules we still follow for no reason. But perhaps there were reasons. Legal assemblies that valued consensus. Compensation instead of vengeance. Oaths binding communities. Structured leadership through loyalty. Measured trade in standardized weights. Respect for autonomy and land. These were not random customs. They were survival strategies. In a harsh landscape, chaos was dangerous. Predictability meant endurance. And over centuries, these quiet rules filtered forward, reshaped, refined, embedded into institutions we now consider ordinary. Parliaments, courts, property rights, contracts, public debate. They feel modern, but they carry echoes. As you settle now into your own quiet space, warm, sheltered, secure, consider how distant centuries continue to shape invisible frameworks around you. You are not standing in a smoky longhouse. You are not weighing silver on a wooden scale. You are not swearing oaths before a gathering field. And yet, in small ways, the structures remain. The world feels orderly not by accident, but by inheritance. Let that thought settle gently. Like snow over northern hills. Like embers fading in a great hall. Slowly, quietly. And perhaps as the past drifts into softness, you too may drift into rest.